Okay, can you guys see me and hear me? Aha, okay, and you can hear me. Good. Okay, well, let's get this started. So look, I've never done this before, and there were a few technical things that I didn't anticipate, so it took me a little bit longer to get started than I expected, but nice to see you all here. And we are live from Strasbourg, France. I'm really happy to do this. I wanted actually to do this for a while and just to get the chance to interact with all of you directly. So before we start, there's a couple of things I'll say. So one of them is I'm going to try doing this for about an hour and see how that goes. The second is that I'm going to be giving first priority to people who are supporting me on Patreon. It's only fair. And but I'm going to hear from all of you, hopefully. And the other thing is that I do have a new CD out, which you'll see details about in the information box at the bottom of the screen there. So the CD is called Iridescent Notation. It just came out a few days ago with impeccable timing, it has to be said. Like, couldn't really be better. But there you go. So that's Iridescent Notation, and that's out from Kairos Records in Vienna, although from what I understand, Vienna is, like most of the world, under lockdown at the moment, and I doubt very much whether it's going to be easy to get it out right now, but anyway. Okay, so the microphone's clipping, I see. Let me turn that down. Should be better. That's beautiful artwork. Oh, thank you. You know, I'm really happy to work with that label because they do a fantastic job on these releases. I'll show you what the thing looks like because I'm actually really pleased with how it came out. So the CD has this beautiful cover, and then, well, there's me. That's not very interesting, but then really nice typography, very detailed notes on all the pieces, and sort of shots of the manuscripts of my pieces. So there you go. It's got quite a thick booklet, lots of information, beautifully recorded. The CD is featuring performances by a group in Kiev, Ukraine. And I have to say, Ukraine, I absolutely love that country. I go whenever I get the chance, and I was completely thrilled to work with some incredible musicians there. So I'm really happy with the way that disc came out, and hopefully when things, well, I was going to say when things get back to normal. I don't know if things will get back to normal. Maybe it'd be better to say when we're on the other side of this massive planetary event. It will be possible to say a little bit more about that. Okay, so look, I had a couple of questions come in already from Patreon, so I'm going to address those. So Ben Schweitzer writes, "Hi Samuel, what are your thoughts on the development of one's personal voice? Is it something that a young composer should attempt consciously, or do you believe that it will happen naturally through the process of composing?" You know, the question of finding your voice is not something that actually ever occurred to me. It's a kind of I honestly, I think finding your voice is a cliche from creative writing programs. I don't give it a great deal of credence beyond that. I don't think it means very much. What I would say is that probably, you know, I think one thing that a lot of young composers do have some difficulty with and find challenging, especially at the outset of their careers, is there's so much to listen to. There are so many different styles of music being practiced simultaneously. It's very hard to get your bearings, to know what you should be focusing on, and sort of find a path through all of the you know, just the incredible array of possibilities that exist. And I think that probably the best thing you can do is to model things that you think work really well as a start. So like if there are particular composers or pieces or directions or styles that you are particularly interested in for whatever reason, then I think a good place to start is to try to copy those models and see what you can learn through doing that. And I mean, that's only going to be part of it, obviously. But as you start to do that, you will naturally misunderstand a lot of what you're hearing. And it's that sort of productive misunderstanding, I think, when you confront the work of other people that will ultimately lead to you developing your own style. But I also don't give a great deal of importance to the notion of finding a personal style, in the sense that it does tend to happen automatically, first of all. And second of all, it's not always necessarily the best question to be asking, because, I would say another way to look at the question is, what is not being done presently that should be getting done? So for example, is there a missing component in today's musical landscape? Is there a particular type of work that you think should be being written and it's not being written? That would be something that, I mean, it sounds kind of obvious maybe, but I would focus on those sorts of things. In other words, is there something that you think is really important, not very many people are doing it, or they're doing it but they're not doing it very well, or they're not doing it enough? Then focus some energy in that direction and do that. And I mean, that's certainly what I did when I was starting out. And if you do that for long enough, you'll eventually get there. The other thing about this sort of question, I also sometimes get asked by students, do I have talent? Do I have a personal style yet? This sort of thing. And like the answer to that is, I think if you sit in a room alone by yourself for, I don't know, minimum 8 hours a day, probably better would be 12 hours a day for 20 years, you'll find out if you have talent. Okay. One other question from Patreon here. So Johnny Cash, okay, I like that, writes, what are some good sources for analysis of spectral music, especially pieces of Muraille like La Barque Mystique, 13 Couleurs du Soleil Couchant, and Ethers? In North America, at least, there is so little detailed analysis of this sort of music, so I have a hard time understanding it. French sources are welcome too. Thanks in advance. Yeah, I haven't actually covered spectral music on this channel yet. That's something I'm planning to do, and in a certain sense, I'm fairly well placed to do so, I would say, because I actually know a number of spectral composers personally, and I went to the Paris Conservatory, where spectral music had a very significant presence. It also has a significant presence at Columbia University in New York City, and in other places as well. There are a number of excellent sources. There's certainly a lot of analytical literature available in French. But one thing you can do, I think, is go straight to the IRCAM website, that IRCAM. They have an entire publishing arm of that institution that produces books on spectral music, and that deals with not only analysis of the music, but also just explains some of the technical procedures. So if you're interested in learning about things like open music, for example, or Max MSP, or other or sort of Patchwork, which is an early version of open music, and other tools that were used and developed by composers associated with the spectral movement, then you can find a whole array of books dealing with those topics. And that is just, you just Google IRCAM, IRCAM, and publishing. Let me just double check that, see if it works. Yeah, actually, well, or you can Google research IRCAM, or IRCAM books, or whatever, and you'll find it immediately. And that's probably the best place to start. And I believe they have books in both English and French. So what do we have in the chat window here? Thoughts on Elliott Carter from Stephen W. Okay, well, yeah, I really like Elliott Carter. I'm of two minds about his music. I think that the piano concerto is a masterpiece. That's an amazing piece. I couldn't I couldn't imagine tackling a piece like that on this channel, you know, because it's so massive. It would be so complicated. There's so many things going on. I would be reduced to talking about it in vague generalities, which is not something I like doing all that much. Although it might be interesting to try to do a kind of a general presentation of the piece. Yeah, there are other works that I'm less convinced by. I also think the sonata for cello and piano is an amazing piece of music. So a lot of the late music, actually the late pieces, in other words, the things he wrote after he turned 90, so the last 12 or 13 years of his production, I think are absolutely amazing. There's a kind of lightness and flexibility and I don't know how else you could describe it, a spontaneity to his musical language, where you sense that the decades of intense, just torturous effort that he went into defining his mature style had somehow just become integrated into something that he no longer had to consciously think about. It was like it became a natural idiom, and I think that's something that composers really should strive for, where you don't have to necessarily agonize over defining the technical parameters of what you're writing. You want those things to sort of sink into the background at a certain point, and allow them to become sort of the, what would you say, a kind of sedimentary layer. It's almost unconscious, and you can invent spontaneously from this sort of language that you've now completely embodied, you've completely absorbed, and that's what you get in the late works of Carter. And so pieces like there's a triptych that he wrote for Heinz Holliger and his wife Ursula, that contains a piece for solo harp, a piece for solo oboe, and a duet for harp and oboe. And those pieces, he wrote them very, very quickly. The oboe piece, Inner Song, which I actually performed a few times, you get the sense, and I've seen the manuscript for this piece too. It looks like it was written very hastily and with sort of in a single gesture. It's very breezy music, and this is not what you sort of associate with Elliott Carter. But I just love that piece, and the idea of something that is almost sort of effortlessly coming out of the composer at this point is something I find very affecting. So I like Elliott Carter. I don't like everything, but the things that I really like. So let's see, what else do we have here? So Gel Zorro writes, at this point in your career, do you still write pieces for fun / just because you want to, or do you mostly write commissions now? Okay, well, the idea, is really to do both at the same time, right? So that the commissions aren't sort of like difficult, burdensome tasks that you have to do in order to pay your rent. You ideally want to have a situation where you're writing things that you want to write, and that simultaneously other people want you to write too. I mean, that's just the ideal. So what I try to do is focus on. I mean, I've been doing this. I've been trying to do this ever since I started writing music, which is not just focus on writing the pieces, although obviously that's the most important thing, but also simultaneously developing really solid, lasting friendships with performers. And that's really carried me through. And I've had some dry times. There's no question about that. But when you have performers who are friends of yours and with whom you share musical values and musical goals and ideals, that's an amazing thing, because then you have people who are going to support you in your vision. I can't emphasize enough how important that is. And so many composers will start off with just maybe a handful of performers, maybe only one or two that are willing to play their work, and they're usually personal friends. And then you can develop these incredible working relationships that can be really, really durable. And I think some very, very good work can be produced that way. I can give you an example. I mean, the last CD I did a couple of years ago, called Music with No Edges, was the result of a collaboration with an ensemble here in Strasbourg. And I've been working with them for over 10 years now. and live in the same. We live in the same city. We see each other often. We've done a lot of projects together, and that makes it very easy to sort of, if we want to do a project together, then it'll be something that we both are excited about doing, and I think that's the ideal thing. So Workpine writes, how are you? Well, I appreciate the question. Thank you. I'm okay. The situation I'm in is strange. So Strasbourg, like all of France, is under lockdown at the moment, which means that if I want to leave my house, I have to fill out one of these. Right, so this is a government form. I have to check boxes saying what I'm doing. Like, I'm going to go do some shopping. I'm going to go have a medical appointment, etc. I have to sign it and date it and carry it with me at all times if I want to leave my house. Right, so, and I'm obviously not the only person in that situation. This is happening all over the place. The first few days were difficult because there was a lot of confusion about what would be happening and a lot of misinformation. In many respects, and I don't mean to be glib about this at all, but in many respects, the life inside my apartment, my house where I live, is approximately the same, except that daycare is closed, so my daughter's home, and which is wonderful, and I'm happy to see more of her, and yeah, and I can't leave my neighborhood. So that's kind of strange, but there you have it. That's how it is. So I mean, obviously, we're all taking great precautions. I have to say that the people in my neighborhood who I've been able to interact with in a very, very distant way over the past few days have been holding up incredibly well through all of this. They've been cheerful and supportive and not complaining, and just sort of accepting that this is something that has to happen. So that's been good. What would Debussy say about the coronavirus? Well, yeah, that's an interesting question. You know, I don't think it would have fazed him, because the time that Debussy lived in was, in almost every measurable respect, a lot worse than the time that we live in now. So, you know, if you compare this situation with the 1918 flu epidemic, for example, or the First World War for that matter, yeah, I don't mean to minimize what's happening, but the world has been through some pretty catastrophic things in the past. Okay, thoughts on the Scandinavian new music scene, or Scandinavian new music? Yeah, look, I haven't been to every Scandinavian country. I've never been to Norway. I'd really like to. I've been to Sweden a number of times, and I go fairly often to Denmark because my wife is Danish, and part of her family lives there, and I really like going to Denmark. I have to say the new music scene there, as far as I've been able to encounter it, is interesting in the sense that they seem to veer towards the extremely experimental, and they love to sort of invent things that are really very new and entirely new genres of music. Like, there's a lot of sort of performance-based things. In other words, things that are not so much about writing a score, but there might be a kind of a visual or a theatrical component to it. There might be an electronic or a film component to it, a sort of multimedia aspect. There's a lot of that sort of thing that I've been able to see, and that's certainly been interesting. Let me see here. You know, the reason, one of the reasons why I was a bit hesitant to do a live stream was I was absolutely convinced I would turn it on and there would be like nobody there. And it's interesting to see all of these comments. So, do you find Mahler's music over emotional or too sentimental? No, I love Mahler. Actually, I'm hoping to do a video on Mahler fairly soon. No, I think Mahler is absolutely amazing, and from almost every perspective. If you have trouble getting into Mahler, and I know some people do, I would always recommend listening to the songs with orchestral accompaniment. The Kindertotenlieder, for example, or the Songs of a Wayfarer, particularly, are just amazing compositions. They're very short, actually, but they're jewels. Every note is perfect, and these are just incredible pieces. And there's an incredible emotional intensity in these pieces, condensed into a very small space also, which I think is quite remarkable. You don't necessarily need to write a 90-minute symphony to get that kind of intensity across. So Mattia Eisenberg writes, how precise is your inner ear? Is it really exact, or is it imaginative sometimes? For example, when writing very complex pieces like your violin concerto. Oh, that's funny, my violin concerto, because, well, I have the manuscript here on my desk. I'm actually in the process of rewriting my violin concerto. I wasn't happy with the first version, and I knew that I could go quite a lot farther than what the first version presented. And the ideas are a lot sharper and a lot clearer now. And so I'm reworking that, and I can show you, actually. I have a page of it here. I was working on this last night. So that's, I don't know how in focus that's going to be. But yeah, so this is a gigantic undertaking. I've been working on it since September, and it's now late March, and I'm hoping that it'll be completely finished in a couple of weeks. To answer the question about my ear, yeah, I spent a long time working on my inner ear, a very long time. It's not going to be exactly like listening to a recording. That's not what the inner ear is like. That's not the nature of the inner ear. But I can certainly, I have a very precise idea of the instruments for which I'm writing, and their different timbres, and what their characteristics are in different registers, their different articulational possibilities, their technical possibilities certainly, and what they sound like in combination. And I think one of the things that is often a difficult concept for beginning orchestration students to understand is the concept of relative instrumental weight. So in other words, the idea that if you have a flute and a trumpet playing together, the trumpet's going to overpower the flute very easily, and also depending on what register those different instruments are in. So all of these things, are factors that you have to take into consideration when you're working on your inner ear. But I think it's also important not to restrict yourself completely to things that you can imagine very precisely. In other words, it's also good, I would say, to allow yourself the leeway to write things. And I'm convinced that a lot of classical composers did this as well, where if you have an incredibly complex 6-part fugue or something like this, there's going to be points, I'm sure, at which the overall effect, the overall texture of the music, something that is calculated, is imagined, but that is still going to have to be tested out in performance. So there are things like that, and for God's sake, there are pieces like Chronochromie by Messiaen, La Terre est un homme by Brian Ferneyhough, Gruppen by Stockhausen, like massive orchestral scores with just hideously complicated things where I'm sure that at a certain point you have to think statistically about what you're writing. But generally speaking, yes, I try to be as precise as possible. I need to know exactly what I'm doing when I'm writing. I mean, I need to know what this or that instrument is doing, how it's going to sound, how it's going to work in combination with other instruments. That needs to be very precise. What restrictions do you set yourself when composing? I'm not sure what sort of restrictions you mean. All sorts of restrictions. Well, like the most obvious one, the first restriction is the instrumentation. It's like once the instrumentation is settled, that's what you have to write for. I usually have a sense of the overall duration, also of the piece. So I need to know, approximately how long it's going to be. I have an idea of the emotional or expressive landscape of the piece, but beyond that. Okay, are we back? Can you guys see me? Okay, and you can hear me. Okay, yeah. You know what? This is like this is sort of like Wayne's World. Like this is a shoestring operation. Okay, yeah. Good. Okay, got sound. So let's see. So the last thing I saw was, will you do any Xenakis analysis? Yes, I will. Definitely. I love Xenakis. He's an example of an incredible, powerful creator. Like somebody who really invented something new. I love composers who are inventors. In other words, they don't simply sort of they don't simply sort of make a minor variation on things that have been done 100 times already, but they really invent a new world. And Xenakis certainly did that. He did it very powerfully. I love pieces like Jonché, an amazing orchestral piece. If you don't know it, it will knock your socks off. It's an amazing piece. Um, Also, works like Yonta, I'm very fond of. I will analyze them definitely at some point. So let's see. Michael writes, do you think that thorough knowledge of tonal harmony is essential / needed for for a contemporary composer? Yeah, I do actually. I think it's extremely important. Um, Now, not everybody's going to agree with that assessment, that's for sure. And it's probably not a very fashionable thing to say, but yeah, I think it's the basis of everything. And even if you end up not using it, um, well, actually, no, I'll qualify that because you will end up using it. Like so-called atonal music and serial music wouldn't exist if it weren't for tonality. Like they're outgrowths of each other, right? And they're related to each other. And the tonal functions, strangely enough, are present in atonal music, in even if only in a kind of ghostly way, right? It's very hard to unhear these things and unlearn them. Stravinsky talked about that when he was writing serial music. He wrote that actually. He couldn't. It was very hard for him to unlearn tonality, and so he would tend to hear his serial music tonally, which is a very interesting thing. It is better to be aware of those things, I think, than to have them happen unconsciously. So, in other words, I've heard atonal music or whatever, like completely chromatic music by composers that where you can tell that they haven't taken the time to understand tonality properly. And what will happen is you'll get bits of whole tone scales, bits of octatonic scales, bits of various different scales mixed together without really too much of a thought of what their effect is and how they can work together and this sort of thing. And you'll have occasional sort of classical ordinary triads happen in the music. Like in other words, the harmonic language won't be properly controlled. And I think if you want to have a harmonic language, if you want to work with pitches, and I recognize that there are a lot of composers these days for whom that is not a priority, but then yes, you need to have a thorough historical awareness. I think that's very, very important. So what else do we have here? Do you have a favorite composer from 1950 to 2000? I think the best at that time was Boulez. Yeah, I would have to say Morton Feldman. Morton Feldman is incredibly important to me as a figure. Um, I for me there are four composers that were extremely important in terms of my own development and in terms of just defining some of my priorities as a musician. And so they are Stravinsky, Varese, Feldman, and Webern. And they all had something in common, which was that they understood, I think better than anybody else, that that music was a complex art in which pitch, duration, timbre, and intensity all have an equal importance. In other words, you're approaching sound holistically in terms of all of its different aspects equally. And they all understood that in different ways. Stravinsky certainly had the greatest range of the four in terms of the sheer scope of pieces that he was able to write, from grand operas to tiny pieces for solo clarinet, and he did all of those things. But Feldman is incredibly important. There's an immediate sensuousness to his music also that that I find just absolutely captivating. I'm completely. I love his work. I love his work. Let's see. Why do you think that concert hall music is in general less complex than it was from 1950 to 1980? Is this because we are in an application stage rather than an experimentation or other conditions? Okay, I think a lot of that is historical. There was a massive infusion of investments into the BBC. Now, the BBC had an incredibly important role in promoting and broadcasting and raising awareness about contemporary composition. And that's something actually that I think is not properly understood by the general public. So you had the BBC, you had the German radio orchestras, and France a little bit later through Radio France and other organizations. And so, look, it was a particular historic period where Europe had obviously very nearly been completely destroyed, and there was a need to rebuild and a need to engage in sort of the positive construction of a new culture. And a lot of composers felt that we needed to turn away resolutely from the sort of aesthetics that were prominent in the years leading up to the Second World War, and usher in a highly utopian, highly prospective, and highly experimental new musical future. And this was possible in part because there was a great deal of support. Now, that's not to say that had that support not been there, there wouldn't have been any good composers, but those two things did go together, and that resulted directly in the creation of things like Gruppen and Carré of Stockhausen, and Plis et non plis of Boulez, certainly the early big Xenakis pieces, Metastasis, and so on. And many, many, many other works. There's also Karl Goeyverts, there's also Henri Pousseur, there's Luigi Nono, there's Maderna, there's Berio. All of these composers were hugely supported in various respects by their respective states. I wouldn't imagine that sort of situation. It was a very particular historic situation. Like, up to that point, composers generally had been supported either through patronage of courts or of kings or whatever it might be, or principalities, or through private patronage. So it was not a normal thing for states to support composers directly. It became a normal thing after the Second World War. But there's no reason to expect that would necessarily go on forever, right? And we are in very different historical times now. And what we are seeing throughout Western Europe is a move away from this state-sponsored model, for sure, towards something else. What that something else is remains to be seen, and there's a great deal of reluctance, I would say, on the part of a lot of composers to accept this. But I imagine, going to see a shift towards more of a private patronage model, which has its obvious disadvantages, but also its obvious advantages, I would say, because one of the disadvantages of a largely state-funded model for composition is that it's unfortunately all too easy for the music establishment to then become politicized, and I don't think that's a good thing. But it's a complicated question. It'll take a long time to get into it. So, do you think the piano is complete in its current form, or would you like it to be developed further? What would you like to see changing with the piano? That's a really good question. Yeah, it seems to me that there is, in fact, a great deal of innovation going on with piano manufacturers. I've seen, in Paris, I've seen a Bösendorfer grand piano that went down to low F, so it had an additional third at the bottom of its range. And I've also seen pianos with 4 pedals that allow for very, very complex resonance possibilities. But you know, the piano is already a phenomenally complicated instrument in terms of its possibilities. And these things, like there has to be a tripartite relationship if you want to develop an instrument, right? So you need to have an impetus on the part of the market, right? So there needs to be performers who are demanding that the instrument evolve in some manner or another. You need to have performers willing to take on the challenge of working with a new or a modified instrument, and you need composers to write pieces for it. So there needs to be a repertoire. And all of those three components need to be in place for that to work. If one of them is missing, then the whole thing collapses and the instrument is a failure. It can't be marketed, or it can't be viable. And there are interesting examples of that in music history. Like, I'm a sort of what would you say? I'm really intrigued by the history of woodwind instruments, especially in the second half of the 19th century, where there was this sudden explosion in the development of entire families of new woodwind instruments: the saxophones, the rothophones, the sarrusophones, et cetera, et cetera. The invention of the bass clarinet, the invention of the bass flute, the piccolo, all of these things happened within a relatively short span of time, and there was just a tremendous degree of experimentation happening. And in all of those instances, you had primarily actually composers requesting these instruments, but also performers. And then you had lots of instrument builders willing to take risks and try things out. I think that's probably harder now because the market for woodwind instruments is saturated, and they're very expensive. They're very time-consuming to build. They've gotten progressively more and more complicated and difficult to build as well, and expensive certainly. So it's much harder to bring a new instrument to market now than it might have been then. And especially if it's something like a grand piano, like imagine what the development cost would be if you wanted to make a new model of a grand piano. They'd be astronomical, and you'd have to make sure that you could find enough clients to make that viable. I wouldn't think it would be easy. Trappist Skunk writes, perhaps this will encourage a new wave of composition because people will be forced to work together. Yeah, I hope so. What is your opinion or thought on Theodor Adorno's thinking on aesthetics? A wide question, of course. Yeah, that's a wide question. Look, I've read Adorno. I'm sympathetic in the abstract to what he was trying to get at, but I disagree with his conclusions. That's probably what I can say. There's a wonderful comment by Schoenberg, actually, about the philosophy of new music, where he pits Stravinsky against Schoenberg and says that Stravinsky is a backwards-looking composer, writing basically completely hollow, dead pastiches, essentially, and he views Schoenberg as this hero, you're sort of pushing forward, at the risk of, or even rather at the necessary cost of not really having an audience. And I don't see that antagonism in those terms. I see it as interesting as in terms of a sort of abstract aesthetic argument. But Adorno, even though he wrote music and was a composer and studied with Alban Berg, he wasn't primarily a composer. And I always get a little bit, I get a little bit unnerved when people who are not themselves primarily composers start making moralistic or aesthetic or philosophical arguments as to why this or that type of music should be written. And Schoenberg himself, who was aware of this book, said, he said a lot of nasty things about Stravinsky, and I don't believe someone should talk about an artist in that way. I certainly don't like everything Stravinsky writes, but one should not speak of him in those terms. And even though he's ostensibly the hero of that book. So I that's a good answer. Let's see. There's 3D printers now that might open up new ways to experiment with new instruments. Yeah, definitely. That's certainly going to change things, no question. Yeah, super exciting. Do you think there's still room for innovation in these times where anything is allowed? Maybe the time is ripe to have the eternal 12 steps per octave. Huh. I wonder what you mean by anything is allowed. I don't actually find that anything is allowed. I'll explain what I mean by that. Look, there are market pressures on composers, just like there are in anybody who's making something that can be sold. And what that means is, uh, composers work with festivals. They work with orchestras. They work with ensembles that commission pieces from them, and they work with performers who need things to play, right? And they work with publishers and record labels and so on and so forth. Obviously the financial implications of contemporary music are not straightforward. They're not complicated, and it's very difficult to make any kind of a direct profit, obviously, from writing writing contemporary compositions. But there are a lot of structural, infrastructural, and institutional restrictions in place, or let's say there is a structure in place that doesn't allow everything to happen. So in other words, there will be the festival that is going to be focusing more on improvisation / sound art, and that isn't going to want to play your new string quartet, for example. That's just a reality of the contemporary musical landscape. Or there might be the festival that only wants to do this or that type of music, and for a lot of composers, it's very hard to find a foothold, and because I think there is actually a great deal of pressure, especially on young composers today, to write in a particular way in order to get played, get published, get their work out there. What I find very when they acquiesce to that pressure unthinkingly, in the hope of short-term gains, and that is what it is. It's short-term gains, right? Because imagine that you adopt a particular style for basically utilitarian reasons, and you have a certain amount of success, and some of the festivals might go for it for a while, and you might get a few commissions. But I mean, it's very hard to parlay that into an entire career, especially if you have behind you a kind of a junkyard of sort of semi-successful pieces that are mostly the borrowed spiritual material of other people. You can't spin that into something durable. I don't think it's a good long-term strategy. It's better to this is the nature of creation. Creation means you're making something that doesn't already exist, and when you're making something that doesn't already exist, even though it may spring from a source, it might spring from a tradition, you're still making something that doesn't already exist, and that means that there isn't necessarily going to be an audience already constituted for it. That's just the eternal reality, the eternal nature of being a composer. Any thoughts on Bert Whistle? I think he's one of the greatest composers of the last 60 years. Yes, I emphatically agree. Bert Whistle is a fantastic composer. I love his work. I would love to do a video on him at some point. I wonder how much attention he gets actually in outside of the UK. You don't hear his name too often in France, which I think is really unfortunate. But France, like any other country, I mean, has its composers that it particularly values, and that's just how it is. Ben Harvey writes, I love your piano pieces. Thank you for saying that. And I'm hoping to learn them soon. What do you think are the most important / your favorite piano works written since the Ligeti Etudes? Huh. The Ligeti Etudes are quite recent, actually. The last book was written when? Around 2000, maybe? Something like that? Yeah, I honestly, I can't think of anything off the top of my head, partly because the composers that I've been closest to, the ones that I went to school with, the ones that I've been exchanging with the most, those are the sort of youngish composers, the composers of my generation that I'm likeliest to be exchanging with, and I'm likeliest to be following their work. They don't seem to be writing a lot of piano music. I don't know a lot of composers writing piano music. I don't exactly know why that is. I think it's partly because it's actually difficult to get piano pieces commissioned. None of my piano pieces have been commissioned. Those are actually, that's a rare instance of a group of pieces in my catalog recently that I work on without a commission, and that's actually a deliberate choice. So those pieces are completely independent projects that I do, usually between much larger projects. And very often, I don't call them etudes, but they are etudes in a certain sense, in that each of them is different and they're working on a different problem or a different idea that I'm trying to develop. And they're enormously stimulating to work on. So I've got actually pieces 5 and 6 finished, and I'm working on number 7. So the next set of 3 pieces I'm hoping will be published by the summer at the latest. Okay, what else do we have here? Do you like Thomas Adès? Yes, I do. He's a very talented composer. Absolutely. His music has a sense of humor too. Like it's extremely witty and funny, and you know, those are qualities that you don't always associate with contemporary music, which I think is unfortunate. But it's so lively and so engaging. I love Thomas Adès. Let's see. It would be great to share your thoughts on classical composers like Mozart. Yeah, I would like to do more of that too. I did a video on Bach. I actually do have a video basically ready to go on Beethoven, and the reason I'm doing it is not because of the anniversary year or anything like that. It's just because I'm completely obsessed with Beethoven's 8th Symphony, and I wanted to do something on that. Look, I have to say something to all of you also, which is that I haven't been as prolific with uploads over the past few months. I'm aware of that, and part of the reason for that is circumstantial. Part of it is that time has become a very scarce resource for me. There are incredible demands on my time, to a degree that I would not have anticipated, and that's meant that a lot of things that I really want to do, I've had to schedule later than I would like. But I have a long list of pieces I'm planning to do on the channel, and I will get to them. Have you thought about doing a video on Lachenmann? Yes, I have. Lachenmann is also, he's a great musician. I recently heard his concerto for the horn section of an orchestra. And my God, that is an amazing piece. It's a spectacular piece. He's an incredible artist. I'm less enamored of the legions of the incredible amount of Lachenmann imitators that are populating the European new music scene. A lot of them seem not quite to have comprehended the thing about his music that I think is most profound. It's like you take the surface qualities of the music, because the surface qualities of Lachenmann are maybe a little bit easier to make a bad copy of, right? Because you can say, well, you can borrow his notation, you can borrow the instrumental gestures, you can borrow the scraping sounds and so on. But if you don't understand the deeper compositional project properly, or where it stems from, or what the expressive desire is in the music, then you're going to be reduced to basically making catalog pieces. And there's unfortunately a lot of that. It's not Lachenmann's fault. Just like it isn't Brian Ferninghaus's fault when you get sort of not very sophisticated copies of new complexity types of scores, or when you see imitations of spectral music. This is just a byproduct of the way contemporary music operates these days. Let's see. Yeah, Beethoven 8th Symphony is a singular work, the C sharp of the last movement. Yes, indeed. Yeah. Well, look, the thing that I'm going to focus on in my video is the scherzo, or not the scherzo, the trio. Sorry. There's an amazing trio in that piece, and everything about it is perfect from an instrumental point of view. He writes a high G in the clarinet, which is a very unusual thing to do at the time. There's a lot of very strange, actually, little instrumental touches in that piece. The octaves on the timpani and the bassoon, for example, which were also unusual at that time. What else? Oh, do you know the piece En Thème for Violin Solo by Pierre Boulez? I would like an analysis someday. I love your videos. Thank you for saying that. I answered this question earlier, but I think it was when my screen was frozen, so I'll answer it again. Yes, certainly I know Antem. I know both versions of Antem. I met Pierre Boulez on a number of occasions when I was a student. He was very present actually in Paris when I was there studying, and very generous with his time. And he took the time to talk with me on a number of occasions, which I really appreciated. And he was very encouraging. Boulez actually attended the premiere of my piece Night Division also, which was a pretty astounding thing for a young composer, I have to say. So I have nothing but positive memories of my encounters with Boulez. And I remember actually sitting through a masterclass that he gave on Antem in Paris. There's lots of information you can find about that piece online, actually. Just Google Antem Boulez analysis. There's a fairly lengthy article about the piece that I recall reading that is not very difficult to find. You can download the PDF. I can't find the link right now, but Google it, you'll probably find it. As I tried to mention earlier, I don't know if this got out or not, a lot of the late Boulez pieces stem from a very small amount of material. Like a lot of them are derived from a single chord or like a small cell that he will then sort of explode into a much larger piece. And that's how Antem works as well. It's actually an offshoot from another composition. Let's see here. Yeah, Stravinsky was a great fan of the trio in the Beethoven 8th Symphony. Yeah, I know. He talks about it in his one of his conversation books with Robert Kraft. Let's see. It seems pop music develops much faster than composed music. Well, that's an interesting point. I would say that most of the development that you see in pop music is stylistic rather than structural. And I would say that it tends to be the opposite in composition. I'll try to explain what I mean. So in other words, in pop music, the basic ingredients tend to be largely the same in terms of the type of harmony that you see, the types of rhythms especially. You see small variations on them, but it's unusual to see a really shocking, unusual chord progression in a pop song. It happens. There's a remark that I always liked by Frank Zappa, where he's talking about Little Deuce Coupe by the Beach Boys, and he talks about how he always liked that song because he uses the 2 degree as a predominant instead of 4, which is like it's a very minor point, but if you have like 80,000 songs that go 1-4-5, and then suddenly you have one that goes 1-2-5, then yeah. Why do so many classical composers have a disdain for popular music? Specifically, what can a contemporary composer learn from genres like rap? Oh, that's a good question. Look, okay, your question contains a generalization. I don't know that so many classical composers do have disdain for popular music. I know that some very vocal composers who have a great deal of influence are not too thrilled about it. So, for example, we recently lost Charles Warrenen, who was a very significant American composer, but who was very vocal about disliking pop music. He believed it was a form of cultural imperialism and very sort of not very fond of it. I think that's unfortunate. If you look at the history of music, if you look at classical music, the classical period, like practically everything in the classical style derives to some extent from something with a popular origin, either a dance pattern of some kind. Classical composers were forever writing pieces based on dance patterns or popular tunes. Look at Bach. An enormous amount of his output is directly concerned with popular hymn tunes and other familiar songs of the day. And the idea was to start with something sort of familiar and elevate it to the highest possible degree and transcend it. And I think that's an extremely noble goal. I would say that, look, what we're having today is a situation where we're in a kind of late romanticism, despite terms like modernism, postmodernism, and so on. The attitudes that you see today reflected in the artistic community, and the attitudes that you would have had in 1890, in many respects, if you boil them down, they're not fundamentally all that different. So with composers like Wagner, you start to see a dislike of the popular, the idea that we're going to focus on an extremely elevated form of expression, and then on the part of popular artists, you have a disdain for this sort of overly lofty, sort of pretentious type of music that is not sort of out of touch with sort of simple everyday realities. You start to get this separation happening. I'm making a cartoon of this, right, to some extent, so it's obviously more complicated than that. These become fairly entrenched attitudes after the late 19th century, where you have a lot of composers just sort of, I think someone like Webern, for example, intensely disliked popular and commercial music. I think, and I hope that what we're getting, and what I'm seeing also, is a more of a willingness on the part of composers to engage with popular styles. And I think that's a very positive thing. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you're putting a drum kit in your composition, or a bass guitar, or whatever it might be, or that you hire a rapper to perform in your piece. Like, maybe it means those things. I would hope for a somewhat more subtle synthesis of those things. Although drum kits are wonderful too. As for rap music, I enjoy rap music. I actually there are some artists I really like. What can you learn from it? Timing, the virtuosity of the performance, the wit, the quick-footedness. There are some like amazing rhythmic innovation also in a lot of the artists that I listen to. Let's see, what else do we have here? Do you have any thoughts on experience of free improvisation? Does improvisation play a role in your compositional process? Well, it depends on what you mean by improvisation. Like, very often when I'm starting a piece, I don't know what I'm going to do, and so I'll take a piece of paper, and I'll start writing down some ideas very spontaneously, and that is a form of improvisation, because I don't have a plan. I don't know what I'm going to be doing. I'm simply trying things and accumulating materials and seeing what sticks and what doesn't. I would consider that to be a form of improvisation, but it's probably not the sort of improvisation that you're talking about. In terms of like actual performances that are entirely improvised from beginning to end, it's not something that I've done. And it's not a direction that I've particularly wanted to focus on personally, although I have many friends who have done it. Let's see. Can you say something about Kurtag? Thanks. Well, Kurtag's an amazing artist. What can you say? Look, I heard a performance that he gave with his wife, his late wife, sadly, in Paris about 10 years ago. They played a duet concert, which was just a very powerful musical experience. They played works by Bach, the sections from the Yatakok piano pieces of Kurtag. That was a great concert. He's an extremely devoted musician, someone who goes incredibly deep into, hi Jordana, who goes very deep into the art. And what we need most are artists who are willing to risk everything and spare nothing, and that's what he's done. Great artist. Hello, Samuel. This is from Samuel Howard. Hi, Samuel. Looking forward to hearing what writing comes out of quarantine. Putting rappers / beatboxers in chamber music. Eve Harrison does this quite successfully in Alveolar Ridge. Yes, look, of course, there are people who've done it successfully. Yeah, absolutely. I don't mean to indicate that can't be done. What comes out of quarantine? Once again, I really don't want to make light of what is a incredibly challenging time for the entire world. But as a composer, I spend a lot of time alone in a room, and the quarantine has reinforced that. And it's no walk in the park, that's for sure. But look, the job of a composer is to sit down and write music. That's what we do, and that's what I'm doing. I've been doing it every day since this whole thing happened. Every day I am in my office and I'm writing. And I would do that. I would continue to do that. I think, well, I've never been put to the test before, but I imagine that no matter how bad things got, I would try to write something, even just a line. Let's see. What would you advise a student composer searching for a teacher in a conservatoire? How would you get to know them? How would you know if it will be a good fit? Okay, that's a good question. Look, it's important to be careful about who you choose to work with when you're a composition student. There's two things that you can do that anyone can do. One of them is send them an email, like write to them, get in touch with them. If you're seriously interested in becoming a student of somebody, there's a lot of preparation involved in doing that. You want to think about what are the pieces that you want to show them, what are the projects that you would want to do if you were admitted as a student to that school. And you would want to do some research on that school and maybe even figure out, who are some of the graduates, what sort of things have they done since then. Maybe you can get in touch with them. They can tell you about their experience. But yeah, you can always write to the teachers and just say, look, I'm interested in becoming a student at this place. I'd like to try out my chances for getting a spot in the composition class. Can I have a phone call with you? If you happen to live in the same city as them, you could ask for a meeting. That's what I did. And actually, when I moved to Paris, this was in 2003, I knew nobody when I got there. And I just sent a few queries out to different people, and I don't think anybody said no. No, I'm not going to meet with you. There's like one person maybe who didn't write back, but most people did. And I was able to meet a lot of people that way, and that was incredibly supportive, and I'm very grateful for that. So yeah, you can always write to people and look and listen to their music and decide for yourself. If you listen to the music of a teacher and you can't stand it, and it's everything you don't want music to be, don't go with that person. Find someone else to study with. That seems like an obvious comment, but a lot of people don't do due diligence with these things. Okay, sorry for repeating the question. Do you prefer making sure your pieces are played the way you want, or sort of stepping away from them since l'auteur est mort? Okay, that's a good question. Yeah, I don't like to micromanage rehearsals. I look, there are composers who work that way. Like we mentioned Kurtag earlier. He's notorious actually for being incredibly difficult to work with in rehearsals. Ligeti also was apparently, according to his biography, actually quite obnoxious in rehearsals, constantly demanding more from exhausted musicians, asking for incredibly minute changes, just sort of driving everybody crazy. You can understand why that happens, because composers, unlike artists working in other fields, we depend upon performers in order to have our work exist in the world. So unlike a painter who can sit in their studio and produce a painting and then it can be exposed in a gallery or sold, the composer has to work with performers. So you can understand why certain composers would be incredibly meticulous about the way their work is presented. But that being said, I think that a piece of music needs to have built into it as a component of your style a way for the piece to be interpreted with a certain degree of flexibility. In other words, it can't simply be a question of the performer sort of mechanically having to reproduce precisely this pitch, precisely this rhythm in precisely this way, or else nothing works, or else like the piece doesn't work. There has to be a degree of flexibility built into the musical language, and I think that great composers have that to different extents and in different ways, obviously, and this depends on the style of a particular composer a great deal. So, for example, John Cage does that. Morton Feldman does that. And Feldman's style has a great deal of leeway in terms of how it's going to be interpreted. Brian Ferneyhough has that, obviously. But also Bach, also Mozart, you know. So, yeah, I prefer to try to write my pieces in such a way that that they can be interpreted flexibly and still make sense. And I place great faith in the performers that I work with and their musical intelligence and their sensitivity. Look, sometimes you get a bad performance. There's no insurance against that. That's going to happen when you're a composer. What are your thoughts on the ingestion of psychedelics in the composition experience, in the composition process? Well, I'm really the wrong person to ask. I'm curious as to why why you would think that I would be the person to ask about that. Let's see. How do composers ensure their music has a strong sense of unity or coherence? Well, it depends on whether you want to have a sense of unity or coherence in your work. Not everybody does. Like, there are composers whose work is deliberately fractured or sort of contains multiple different stylistic vantage points in the same piece. I don't work that way personally. I prefer a highly sort of a kind of a tightly controlled and a highly unified style, and one that hopefully has coherence across multiple works as well. How do you ensure that? Well, restricting your material, for one thing, making judicious choices about what you're going to put into a piece and what you're going to leave out. Most of composing is leaving things out and selecting things. It's way more of that than generating ideas, I think. Let's see. Thoughts on pitch set analysis and other more contemporary group theoretic and mathematical models in musical composition and analysis. Those are two different questions. Pitch class analysis I'm not a big fan of. I don't find it to be a useful analytical tool, and I don't use it. I know how it works, and I teach it as part of my course in 20th Century Harmony that I give here in Strasbourg. But I don't use it, and I don't recommend it to students. I teach it so that they know what it is and what it, the fact that it exists, because you're going to probably encounter it as a student. The problem with pitch class analysis is that first of all, it reduces music down to a single parameter, which is pitch, and that's something actually that you do get a great deal of, unfortunately, in musicology. Pitch is one component of an incredibly complicated and rich art form, and sort of abstracting it out from all the other dimensions and reducing it down to that one dimension, I find incomprehensible. And also taking ordered collections of pitches that occur in a particular order, in a particular configuration, in a particular register on a particular instrument, and so on, and collapsing them down into these sort of abstract groups of note heads. It just doesn't rhyme for me with the way anybody actually listens to music or perceives it. So I don't find it to be a useful analytical tool. So, apropos of late Romanticism, what is your view on inspiration and, in general, in hard work / routine in general? What do you do if writer's block sets in? Any particular way of getting back to the muse? There's no excuse for writer's block. Writer's block is a myth. It doesn't exist. Look, there's always work to be done. There's always a problem needing to be solved. And there are so many ways for getting out of a creative impasse. Like sometimes you're just tired and you need to stop. You need to take a break. You need to go on a walk. You need to go for a swim. You need to listen to something. Everybody has a different threshold for their concentration, I would say. Although I would recommend seeing how far you can push that. Like how long can you sit down and work on really difficult creative work with real concentration before you start to lose your focus? And that's different for different people. But in my case, I can manage about 3 hours of really serious focus. Now, when I say serious focus, it means I'm here in my office. This is where I sit, and I've got my materials, I've got my paper and pen and all that, and the rest of the world doesn't exist. Like, I'm so absorbed in that task. It's like it's effectively a form of blindness. Actually, I'm reading this book. I'm sure many of you have read this already. Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. He talks about this. It is actually effectively a form of blindness when you're really absorbed in a task. Everything else ceases to exist. That's called, being in a flow state or being immersed in your work, and that's the state you want to be in. And seeing how long you can sustain that. And I would also recommend stopping before you start wasting your time. Like, when people are tired, they've sort of exhausted their reserves of concentration, then they start doing silly stuff like checking email too often, going on Facebook, that kind of thing. And like, without necessarily articulating to themselves that they're actually no longer working. But it's like, you'll think, well, I'm still in my office, so I'm still working on my piece. It's like, no, you're not. So don't push it farther than you need to. So I can do 3 hours in a sitting, and then I usually need to take a break and do something else. And I try to set my days up in such a way that I can be maximally in a state of freshness and concentration and intense focus as much of the time as possible. So what that means in terms of my daily routine is I prioritize composition in the morning, when I'm at my most fresh, and at midday I stop and usually I go for a swim or a bike ride or something like that. That's incredibly important. Otherwise, I would not be able to live the insane life that I live. It wouldn't be possible otherwise if I didn't actively do some kind of sports on a regular basis. And bear in mind, my schedule, like, I wake up at 7, sometimes earlier, and I'm going until midnight almost every day. So, do you ever get dismayed by the future of art? No, I don't get dismayed by the future of art because it's not here yet, and you can't get dismayed about things that aren't here. What do you think music will be like in 100 years? I don't know what it will be like tomorrow. 100 years is way beyond my pay grade. How do you usually plan a piece? I don't plan pieces. What I mean by that is the piece emerges organically, and sometimes it happens quickly, and sometimes it takes a bloody long time. That's the case with my violin concerto. I already spent 8 months writing the piece, and now I'm spending another 8 months rewriting it. And I've done this many times. Most of my pieces, actually, most of the published pieces that I've done, I've written at least twice. I'm not in favor of that situation. That's not how I would have chosen necessarily, but to do things. But that's how. I mean, I can't let a piece go unless I'm convinced that I've done everything I can with it, and sometimes I need to do it twice. James Knight writes, wanted to play your Strasbourg Quartet later in the year with some friends without seeing the music. How important is the contrabass clarinet? There aren't many in Melbourne. Yes, I know. I've heard that actually from a friend in Australia. There aren't that many contrabass clarinets there. Yeah, you need the contra to play the piece. Yeah, sorry. It doesn't work without it. Okay, guys, I'm getting a bit tired here. I can't believe how many questions there are. This is amazing. Thank you for participating in this. It's been a very good experience. I'd like to do this again. I can't do 3 hours of answering questions. No, I can't. I'm going to have to stop now. It's late here. Look, I really appreciate the questions. I'm going to be back soon with videos on YouTube, and I really look forward to talking to all of you guys again. Keep sending the questions. You can send them. I also want to say, I'm not active on Facebook. I am quite active on Twitter, and if you guys want to stay in touch, one easy way to do that is through Twitter, because I'm pretty responsive there. You can also send YouTube comments if you have questions, and I really do my best to answer them. I can't always answer everything, but I do try, and we'll do this again. And next time I'm going to do it with fewer technical problems, because I kind of know how it works now. And I'll also announce it ahead of time, because yeah, I actually didn't realize that you can make an event on YouTube and sort of plan these live streams ahead of time, which you'd think would be a pretty basic thing to know. Okay, good night, everybody. Talk to you again.